Grace Ellison arrived at the venue 3 hours before her wedding was set to begin, her garment bag over her arm, her heart full in the particular way it only gets full once, right before you marry the person you've built your whole life around. She pushed through the grand double doors, expecting to see white orchids and cascading fairy lights. The exact vision she and her fiancé Marcus had spent 8 months carefully designing. Instead, she found gold balloons spelling out, "She said yes," a banner with her younger sister's name stretched across the far wall, and caterers setting out champagne flutes for an entirely different event. Her mother, Diane, stood in the middle of it all, beaming, clipboard in hand, directing florists with the practiced authority of a woman thoroughly in her element. "Mom," Grace said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What is this?" Diane turned, and for just a moment, something like guilt flickered behind her eyes, before it hardened into the same defensive certainty Grace had seen her whole life. "Oh, honey, I was going to call you. Ashley got engaged this week, and this venue was already available, and it just seemed like fate. We moved your reservation, you understand. This is such a big moment for your sister." Grace stood there in the middle of the venue she had spent $100,000 reserving, surrounded by decorations celebrating an event that wasn't hers, and felt the particular, familiar sting of being erased in her own life. Guests were already beginning to arrive, dressed for a wedding, confused expressions forming as they took in balloons that clearly weren't meant for a bride and groom. Grace's younger sister, Ashley, swept into the room in a stunning cocktail dress, practically glowing, accepting congratulations from bewildered relatives who had shown up expecting to watch Grace get married. "You can just book somewhere else, right?" Diane said, touching Grace's arm with an expression that suggested she genuinely believed this was a reasonable, minor inconvenience. "It's not like you can't find another venue." Grace looked at her mother for a long moment. She thought about saying something, about the 8 months of planning, about the deposit, about the fact that this humiliation was unfolding in front of nearly 200 people who had come to watch her wedding. But she didn't say any of that. She simply turned, walked back through the double doors, and left, her garment bag still over her arm. Her wedding dress never even unpacked. She didn't cry until she was in the car. And even then, mixed in with the hurt, was something else, a quiet, simmering certainty that her mother and sister had just made a mistake far bigger than either of them understood. To understand how Grace ended up standing in that lobby, absorbing yet another humiliation from her own family, you'd have to understand the shape her whole life had taken around Ashley. Grace was the older daughter, the responsible one, the one who had learned early that her role in the family was to accommodate. Ashley was 2 years younger and had been, for as long as Grace could remember, the center of gravity around which the entire household orbited. Every celebration, every milestone, every family gathering seemed to somehow circle back to Ashley's needs, Ashley's feelings, Ashley's happiness. Grace's own achievements, her promotions, her successful career in corporate law, her steady, loving relationship with Marcus, were acknowledged briefly before conversation inevitably drifted back toward whatever Ashley currently had going on. Grace had spent years quietly absorbing this dynamic, telling herself it didn't matter, that she was mature enough not to need the same attention Ashley demanded. She had funded her own wedding entirely herself, refusing to ask her parents for a cent, wanting this one thing, this one massive, meaningful milestone, to be entirely her own, built without strings or comparisons attached. She and Marcus had spent months planning every detail of the venue, an exclusive estate known throughout the city for its elegant gardens and its notoriously difficult booking process. The reservation alone had cost $100,000, money Grace had saved carefully over years, determined to give herself and Marcus the wedding they'd both dreamed of. She hadn't known, walking into the venue that afternoon, that her mother had spent the previous week quietly working behind her back, calling the venue's events coordinator directly, explaining a fabricated story about a family emergency requiring an urgent date change, insisting she had the authority to make arrangements on Grace's behalf. The coordinator, new and eager to accommodate what seemed like a distressed mother of the bride, had transferred the reservation without properly verifying anything with Grace herself. By the time anyone at the venue realized the actual bride had never approved any of it, Diane had already filled the space with balloons celebrating her other daughter's engagement. When Grace called Marcus from the car, her voice shaking with a mixture of humiliation and fury, he didn't yell or panic. He simply listened, carefully, asked a few precise questions about exactly what had happened, and told her he would handle it. What Diane and Ashley didn't know, what Grace herself rarely mentioned, because Marcus had always preferred to keep his professional life separate from family gatherings, was that Marcus held a significant ownership stake in the hospitality group that owned and operated the venue's parent company. He wasn't simply a guest whose wedding reservation had been stolen. He was functionally one of the people with real authority over how that venue conducted its business. Within the hour, Marcus had contacted the general manager directly, not as an outraged groom, but with the calm, measured tone of someone who understood exactly how serious an unauthorized reservation transfer actually was. He requested a full review of the booking records, the internal communications, and the security footage from the days leading up to the wedding. What the investigation revealed was worse than a simple scheduling mix-up. Diane had explicitly misrepresented herself during her calls with the events coordinator, falsely claiming authorization she did not have, pressuring a junior employee into bypassing standard verification procedures that existed specifically to prevent this kind of situation. It wasn't an innocent misunderstanding. It was, in the venue's own internal terminology, unauthorized interference with a paid, confirmed reservation. The kind of conduct that carried real consequences, both for the employee who had allowed it and for the family who had orchestrated it. By the following morning, the venue's management had launched a formal internal review. The events coordinator who had approved the unauthorized transfer was placed under disciplinary review for failing to follow verification protocol. Ashley's engagement booking, hastily arranged on the back of Grace's stolen reservation, was formally canceled. The deposit Diane had put down to secure the last-minute booking was forfeited entirely, non-refundable under the very terms she'd rushed past in her hurry to hand her older daughter's wedding over to her younger one. And because the situation involved deliberate misrepresentation to secure services under false pretenses, the venue's legal team indicated they were reviewing whether further action was warranted. Diane found out just how serious the situation had become when she received a formal call from the venue's legal department, informing her that her actions were under review for potential fraud, and that any future business with the venue's affiliated properties would be permanently restricted. It was only then, hearing the cold procedural language of legal consequence, that Diane began to understand that the man her daughter had married wasn't simply someone she could charm or maneuver around. The family group chat, once filled with photos and enthusiastic congratulations for Ashley's engagement, exploded into panic. Ashley called Grace in tears, insisting she hadn't known the full extent of what their mother had done, though Grace noted she'd been perfectly willing to accept the venue, the flowers, and the congratulations without asking too many questions about how any of it had come together so conveniently. Diane called repeatedly, her tone shifting from defensive justification to genuine panic as the reality of potential legal exposure set in, insisting that Grace needed to speak to Marcus, to make this go away, to fix what she now called a simple misunderstanding that got blown out of proportion. Grace let the calls go to voicemail for 2 full days. When she finally responded, it wasn't to rescue anyone. She arranged a single phone call with her mother, her tone calm, controlled, entirely different from the humiliated silence she'd carried out of that venue days earlier. "I'm not going to ask Marcus to make this disappear," Grace said. "You lied to secure a venue that wasn't yours to give away. You did that knowing exactly what it would cost me, the deposit, the planning, the humiliation in front of 200 guests. This isn't a misunderstanding, Mom. This is what happens when you spend 20 years treating my life as something you're entitled to rearrange for Ashley's benefit." Diane tried, predictably, to pivot toward guilt, toward the language of family loyalty she'd always used to keep Grace compliant. "We're your family, Grace. Family forgives things like this. Family doesn't steal your wedding venue and expect you to simply understand," Grace said. "I'm not angry because you love Ashley. I'm angry because loving her has always meant erasing me, and I'm done accepting that as normal." Marcus, present for the conversation, offered no intervention, no softening, No quiet suggestion that Grace ease up. He simply stood beside her, a steady, silent confirmation that he supported every boundary she was finally choosing to draw. The original wedding, delayed by only 2 weeks while the venue worked through the mess Diane had created, was ultimately restored. The actual reservation, the actual date, quietly reinstated once the investigation confirmed exactly what had happened and who bore responsibility for it. Grace and Marcus married in the gardens they'd originally chosen, surrounded not by the full sprawling guest list that had once included every extended relative eager to witness the spectacle, but by a smaller, more intentional gathering. Close friends, a handful of relatives who had stood by Grace rather than excusing her mother's behavior. People who genuinely celebrated her happiness rather than treating it as background noise to someone else's story. It was, Grace would later say, the wedding she had actually wanted all along, even if it took losing the first version to understand what mattered more than a guest count or a lavish reception. There was no tension simmering beneath the surface, no watching her mother's attention drift toward Ashley mid-ceremony, no quiet calculation about who was managing whose feelings. There was simply love, undiluted by decades of favoritism, filling the space where genuine family should have been all along. Diane's reputation among the extended family suffered considerably in the aftermath, word of what she'd done spreading through relatives who had once assumed her devotion to Ashley was simply enthusiastic parenting, rather than the systematic erasure of her other daughter. Ashley, for her part, seemed genuinely shaken by the fallout, forced for the first time to reckon with how much of her life had been built on a foundation of favoritism she'd never had to examine before, since she'd always been the one benefiting from it. Whatever trust either of them had once taken for granted from extended family and friends eroded considerably, replaced by a wary reassessment of exactly what kind of people they'd shown themselves to be. Grace didn't spend much energy tracking the consequences that followed. She had already decided, in the quiet weeks after her actual wedding, that she was done organizing her emotional life around her mother's approval or her sister's comfort. She and Marcus built their new life together with deliberate distance from the family dynamics that had defined so much of Grace's earlier years. Not out of spite, but out of a hard-won understanding that peace mattered more than performing forgiveness for people who had never once extended her the same consideration. She learned, in the end, something she wished she'd understood far earlier in her life. Love could not survive in a space where favoritism consistently replaced fairness, no matter how many times that imbalance got dressed up in the language of family loyalty. Boundaries, she came to realize, were not some betrayal of family closeness. They were simply self-respect, finally given room to exist. Actions she had learned firsthand always carried consequences, even when the people responsible spent years assuming they never would. And true family, she understood now, sitting in the home she and Marcus had built together, wasn't defined by blood or obligation. It was defined by people who celebrated your happiness instead of quietly, persistently trying to take it for themselves.